All TFT experts and analysts agree. Set 12, Laud Syndra was the most overpowered and egregiously imbalanced 2-cost of all time. She got nerfed heavily alongside a bunch of other reroll comps. So what's the next best comp? Let's dive into the TFT Academy tier list for the 14.16 patch and find out what kind of heroic efforts you need in order to climb this patch. Before we start, I want to remind people that if you are a TFT Academy patron, you can also check out our meta read. We put a little blurb up here. You just go to study hall and meta read section. And it's a newsletter that gives you additional commentary on the patch and like why we organize different things in certain tiers, and also what are the best openers, as well as some sleeper tech. And we do a few updates every single patch. So check that out if you haven't already. Starting off at the top of S tier, we have another reroll comp that's taking over the meta. And it's another 2-cost AP, but it's not Syndra, it's Ahri. The main premise between Ahri Scholar reroll is that you get a bunch of 3-stars and you Arcana Charm Ahri to get a ton of AP and then burst a bunch of units that are surrounding your front line and doing true damage to them. By positioning Ahri in the back row in the 5th slot, we call this D5 because it's A, B, C, D, and it's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, D5, and then you go A5 with your tank, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. The units will end up walking around Lillia in this exact slot, and then Ahri shoots a straight line and deals damage to all of the units and maximizes their surface area for her Orb of Deception. And that's a really important detail because Ahri ends up kind of trolling a lot of fights if she's mispositioned poorly. So a lot of times you want to put her in these spots to get people to wrap around your tank and hit at least 2 targets. One misconception about this composition is that people used to think that this was a Zoe reroll comp because you put items on Zoe in the early game and you 3-star her quickly and you have her burst on a bunch of champions. But then what we realized is you actually put items on Zoe and then remove those items to put them on Ahri later, then give Zoe the leftover items. One thing that's up for debate is whether or not blue buff is actually best in slot for Ahri because she actually casts a little bit too fast with blue buff. Usually this is because you actually need time, like 2 seconds for the units in the 6 and 7 hex to walk around Lillia. And if she's casting the orb, you might actually miss like the units like walking down here and you miss a little bit of damage that way. And so by that note, if you end up slamming Shojin instead, that actually might be even better for Ahri, or maybe Adaptive Helm, just something that makes it so that you don't immediately cast the orb too quickly. Leftover AP items like Shred and Morello can be put on Ryze. And then for the tank items, a lot of people debate whether or not you want to put it on Poppy versus Lillia 3. The stats say that Lillia 3 is a little bit better, but I personally think that it doesn't matter very much, just whatever you hit first. I think it also could be influenced by the fact that high horsepower Lillia is stronger than Witchy Wallop Poppy, which we'll talk about later on. Some good augments for this composition. The best one is Spellblaze by far. It did get nerfed. We haven't updated the tooltip here, but it still does so much damage and is usually one of the primary augments you're looking for when playing this composition. It gives it almost an entire half placement or better for this AVP. Any good econ is really powerful, like Prismatic Ticket to help you get the rolls early. Also, if you take other things like Higher Education and Learning the Spell, really powerful things for some of these like Scholar reroll type traits, also very good. A fun augment in particular is an upgraded adventure, which is if you get 4 champions to 3-star, aka Poppy, Lillia, Ahri, and Zoe, then you get a fantastic upgrade. There's also a couple other variations that people have played where they roll for 1-star Vanguards. Like instead of playing around Hecarim early, they roll for Blitzcrank 3 and Warwick 3. I'm not entirely sure if that's like optimal, but that's one possible way you can activate it and then transition out of those tanks later on as you're getting things like Arcana online. Another alternative positioning that I want to show you besides what we did with the A5 D5 is also go A6 D5 and leave a center gap. And this punishes a lot of units that want to be in the center. Like let's say they play a 1-2-3 front line, they can actually wrap this way around Lillia, and then you can get a nice 3-unit surface area around your tank that way. Other than that, it's pretty much just a standard 1-cost reroll. You try to roll as much as you can at 3-1 to collect all the 1-cost, but keep in mind because you are chasing multiple 3-stars, you have to slow roll above 50 gold because you're really unlikely to hit all of them at the very first get-go. And as we mentioned, it's a really good composition for all the other hero augments, which we'll cover in a little bit. Speaking of the other hero augment, high horsepower Lillia, I mean, this is pretty much just the second version of this composition where you play Lillia as another carry, and you really won't have the items to actually go for frontline alongside it. So a lot of times you end up playing like, Thieves Clothes on Poppy or some other like random set of items on Poppy, and then Zoe 3 also takes leftover items. But it plays extremely similarly, except you're just going for Lillia as your primary carry, and she does a ton of damage. One thing to note is that she does have extra movement speed due to high horsepower, so you can actually have a little bit of positional flexibility. But I realized that when you put her somewhere like here, they end up having Lillia stop a unit here in the top right a lot of times. So actually the best place to position Lillia might even be one further hex here, or just straight up putting her where Poppy is instead. So you probably have to fix that. Other than that though, very similar augments. A couple of other things worth noting is that Featherweights is really good if you play a bunch of 1 and 2 costs. Martyr ends up being really good if you end up playing a melee carry. So Lillia ends up getting more healing, which could be really valuable as well. And don't forget things like Item Collector is just generically very OP, and you really ultimately want a bunch of AP onto your units to go for those big nukes. Another hero augment that's terrorizing ladder is Molten Caramel Rumble, which is playing a mixture of Vanguard and Preserver. As a general note right now, 4 Vanguard seems to be a very strong trait in general, and so a lot of reroll comps that we're going to be playing are going to be predicated on playing 4 Vanguard. In fact, I'm pretty sure you could probably play 4 Vanguard Flex currently because the units themselves are just quality. Mordekaiser is a really good tank that deals a bunch of damage. Galio adds a little bit of CC. Tompkins adds a lot of CC. And Rumble has utility. Plus, he ends up being quite a durable tank because of the way he scales with AP and durability in itself. But that's not even what Molten Caramel does. Molten Caramel now gives you less mana cast and actually does a huge amount of burst. So now he turns into sort of like an AP champion that tries to push through one of the sides very quickly. I liken it to how you would play Gnar from the previous set in Inkborn Fables, where he would throw a rock and try to assassinate a weak side target and then get to the back line. Rumble does the exact same thing because he just does so much burst. Backline, you often play Tristana because she's a 2-cost blaster, so you want to roll at 6 above 50 gold to try to go for multiple 2-cost 3-stars. On that note, you probably can also try to chase Galio 3 and Mordekaiser 3, but they are going to be very contested units, so I wouldn't stress out too much about it. Only if you are very far ahead of the curve and you can afford to hold them. One thing to know is that Rumble actually does wound enemies, meaning that you don't necessarily need to build a Morello or a Sunfire as quickly. You still can justify building those items, especially because Rumble only is going to hit a portion of the field versus other units that might want to have anti-heal applied to them across the entire board. But I would probably put that as a lower priority. If you don't have things like BT and Joe Godling because you need too many rods, you can always play something like Spark, and that's where High Voltage comes in. Just helps you solve your items, or even things like Magic Wand. Another item that I see people do well with Rumble is Crown Guard as well as Adaptive. So there's a bunch of different ways you can actually itemize Rumble. Just try to get him 3 item as soon as possible and tempo really hard. Other augments worth considering: Unified is good. Row Rejuvenation is also pretty good. That's something that's been buffed this patch. Shields Up is good with any kind of Vanguard setup, which you'll see throughout this entire video. And Support Golem ends up always being good because you end up clumping a lot. So things like Randuins or Banshees or Zeeks, etc. is always just really powerful. Push levels and add Preserver and Arcana, and you end up having a really good recipe for success. Definitely can win a lot of lobbies. Portal is probably going to be one of the most contested verticals currently in the metagame. However, I would say that right now with Portal, you really only want to play it if you can get a Portal emblem. The current version that we're going to show you is how you play a 10 Portal setup, and most commonly, 10 Portal is going to win the game if you get something off of a Trainer Golem, for example, or a Wandering Trainer. And this is because the Golem counts as a unit on level 9, so you don't actually have to get to 10 to play 10 Portal. You can just be at 9, have the Golem or the Wandering Trainer, and then get to 10 Portal that way. If you're not playing a Portal emblem and you play Vertical Portal, you're going to be playing 8 Portal on level 8, and that gets a little bit awkward because, that means you hit Nora and Yuumi, and you have Galio, but you don't have a third mage like Nami, which ends up being really important for the CC and for the 3 mage. And so you end up just being a lot weaker and have less utility across the board. And so a lot of times if you don't hit Portal +1, I actually think that you scale down the number of portals and you replace things like Kassadin, Jace, and maybe even other units like Galio and Zoe, and then just play high quality things like Ryze, Taric, Nora, and then play a bunch of 4 and 5 cost that complement it. Like instead you could play like Arcana with Ahri and Xerath, or you can play more Preservers instead and try to play like Ryze Preservers. I would not recommend staying on 6 to 8 portals late game without that +1. If you do, you end up probably playing for like a 4th place, maybe a 3rd at best if you're super high rolling ahead. But yeah, I wouldn't consider that. We do actually end up having Ezreal 3 as a possible way for you to think about a way to play alternative lines within Vertical Portal if you really want to stay in that line. Ezreal 3 is really good with red buff and IE, and we put Last Whisper here because he's the only AD champion, so he ends up having to shred for himself. But usually you only do this if you're like stuck on 8 and you have a Portal emblem, and you just have to keep rolling because you need to find like charms and you need to like kind of keep rolling in order to play for your HP lead or deficit. And so it's kind of rare for you to be in that scenario. So that's why we had this Ezreal here, just to show you an alternative out to play for. Best in slot item for Ryze is also Rageblade and AP, although you can also try to play Ryze with just straight up AP items. I've seen him play like Archangel's Deathcap and like, you know, Nashor's or Dual Gauntlet, like all of these rod items, and he ends up doing pretty well. But usually that only works in a Scholar setup. I see Ryze struggle a little bit without having something to manage in, and I think Rageblade is just a really good item for Ryze in that way. The augments that are good for Portal are pretty straightforward, which is anything that gives Portal, so Wandering Trainer, Portal Crown, Portal +1. If you get a Spatula start, you can also consider Portal as well. The tricky thing about a Spatula with Portal is that you want a lot of rods in this composition, and so using a rod for that Spatula just means you're going to have fewer items. If you do that, I recommend you take other item augments like Transfiguration and Big Grab Bag. Little Buddies is actually quite powerful considering how many 1-2 costs you play. You play 4 at least, Jace, Caston, Zoe, and Galio, so you get a lot of buddy value. And then everything else is pretty generic, like some econ to help you hit, some combat power like Exiles, because it doesn't really matter how you actually space out, and other things like Support Golem, which are always good. Kalista is probably the most reliable 4-cost carry to play around. She caps also insanely high, and she ends up being very versatile with her secondary duo carry. Like you can play Fiora, or you can play, you know, Camille in this entire line. Maybe you end up just deviating entirely and playing like Kalista Karma. But the big problem with Kalista is that you need a ton of resources. You need a lot of money, you need a lot of items, and preferably you have like a combat augment and you are getting combat charms. But if you get all that rolling, then you actually have so much power into your composition that you can actually bulldoze and win late game fights. Even against capped hero augment comps that are really strong, Kalista can outcap them if you can get there. And so usually we recommend you starting off with like an econ augment, like Raining Gold, Slammin', Epoch, you know, the usual econ augments that help you snowball and get to a fast 8 and roll out of gold. But the most important thing is that you also try to avoid rolling to 0 and going to 9 for 5 cost. Because if you get stuck at 8 rolling for 4 costs, you're not going to be able to unlock the true power of the composition, which is having these late game 5 costs with major impact. But the core is pretty flexible. All you really need is Kalista, Zilean, Camille, Rakan, and you get, you know, Fairy, Multi-Striker. Well, you just add a +1 to Multi-Striker of some kind, and you get Preserver with Chrono. And then you can kind of put anything. You know, people are starting to experiment with like Wukong frontline. So if you have Wukong 3, yeah, by all means, ditch the Nasus and Briar and go for Wukong 3. Add more preservers. If you're playing Fiora, go for Fiora Gwen. In this case, it's Fiora Kali. Maybe you get more Varus and you get Pyro. So you go Pyro Kalista. There's a lot of different things you can do with it, which is what makes her so strong. This is in contrast to how other 4 costs like Ryze and Varus, which we'll talk about in a little bit, require you to hit that emblem to unlock its true potential. Kalista doesn't need it. The trade-off is that she's quite tricky, and there's a lot of ways for you to just be stuck on 1-star Kalista, 1-star Nasus, 1-star frontline, and then just die and feel like, this comp's like so bad, it's just so hard to hit. I just can't ever get online and everyone else is hitting. So I definitely see this comp as being one that someone has to master, and it's going to be a little bit tricky to actually fully unlock its potential unless you specialize in it. Build Different is still really good in the stats, and that's because the 4 costs are now better. Like Varus got buffed, for example, and Ryze got buffed, so that just means that Build Different got buffed. You can't actually play Ryze to Nami, but Milio's a really good unit in Build Different in particular because he doesn't have a unique trait. If you play Morgana or you play Xerath, for example, they have a unique trait that deactivates Build Different, but Milio doesn't have that. And it gives items to your other upgraded 4 costs, so it just gives you a ton of power. I really love Nami as a 4 cost unit. You can actually play multiple Namis and give them multiple items, so that way you spam cast. There's actually like a really fun chain CC where if you itemize Tahm Namis in the back, you can actually just like have Nami cast and Tahm cast and Nami cast again, and then your second Nami cast, and then it kind of creates this giant wave of CC that they can't overcome. But be flexible. It is a little bit hard to play Build Different because it's really predicated on whether or not you understand the power of upgraded units and what they contribute. But the general rule is that units that are good with attack speed and don't need traits to have high impact are very, very good. So an easy example could be that Nilah is an Eldritch unit. Eldritch only powers the summon, it doesn't power Nilah. And 2 warrior, not that important for Nilah, even though it's nice if you give her things like Bloodthirster and Last Whisper. She's a really good early game carry. So Zilean, really good utility unit. Yeah, Chrono is great team-wide heal and utility, and preserves are good. But Zilean adds a stun And when he has attack speed, he casts more often. And so he's a high value unit as well and built different. Same thing with Shen, just to be able to cast multiple times in a fight with CC early game is also fight swinging. So you kind of get a little bit of what we're thinking about, which is like the utility, the impact of whether or not they actually need their traits to have an actual influence on the fight. One thing to note that I really like is I'm the carry now, and other golems actually benefit from built different. Fun fact. So those units do not have traits. They also get additional HP and attack speed. Zap Attack is still really good. It's no longer the best hero augment to start off. Originally, we thought it was, but then some other things like Sweet Tooth took the spotlight. But now Zap Attack is a really efficient way for you to play Kog'Maw. Kog'Maw also is listed out just as a regular composition as well if you don't have the Blitzcrank version where you can play around Rumble and Nunu. But the Zap Attack Blitzcrank version is just really lean and also plays well into the metagame because other people are rerolling Zoe and other one costs, so you can just play Blitzcrank and pull other one costs out of the pool. So it's a little bit of a meta shift. Not to mention that I think we've kind of realized that Blitzcrank 3 is also quite an insane tank. I've seen Blitzcrank 3 tank just as well as 2-star 4 costs if you give him the right items. If you also have good augments, be his friends or shields up to help the Blitzcrank also be CC immune, very, very good. So, don't sleep on this. I personally don't really try to reroll Kog'Maw unless I either hit like a really insane augment for it, like 2 healthy, or I hit things like Zap Attack for Blitzcrank. Sweet Tooth Nunu is also playable in this line, but people have really just like fallen out of favor with it because it got nerfed really hard. And so instead, I'd rather play around Blitzcrank. But other than that, you're playing the same core units. Slow roll at 5, pick up all the Tristana Kog'Maws. Once you hit Blitzcrank 3, level to 6, and roll for the 3 stars there, and then move to 7 to play Jinx. Your level 8 unit can be another Vanguard. I talked about this in my hero augments video. Blitzcrank has Unending Despair, Forbidden Idol, and Hulk Crusher. Those are also some really good artifacts for you to play into. And if you want to have more information on the hero artifacts, I made a hero augment guide, which mostly should still be intact. There's a couple of changes, of course, because things got buffed and nerfed. But you should check it out if you want to see all the more hero augments in detail. Last but not least, this is probably going to be something that changes over the course of the patch as people catch on to how good Galio is as a unit. But Deja Vu Galio is really good in the stats. The problem with Galio right now is that, like I said, people are going to play a lot of Vanguard frontline this patch. And so Galio is going to be hard to hit 3-star reliably. Similar to how people played like Nico in the previous set where there's like Heavenly Nico, but she was also Mythic. So she was like pulled in some of these other comps or, be splashed as some of those Sage traits. It feels like Galio is just because he's triple traded as a 2 cost, as a Mage, Vanguard, and Portal, people just play him all the time. That being said, if you do end up getting him with the double Rage Blade and the Gunblade setup, it is very, very good. Galio is also really good with Portable Forge, where you can get like Wit's End, Rapid Fire Cannon, and surprisingly, Fishbones is really good on him too. You are a stall-based composition because you want to get to 6 Vanguard. It's very common for you to play 6 Vanguard Galio, so don't be afraid to take the new Vertically Inclined. That gives you more damage if you have less active traits than your opponent. Another augment I want to shout out is Anger Issues. This is one of the few comps where I think Anger Issues is actually quite good. The only thing about Anger Issues is that it doesn't really do a lot for some of the other units, but if you have triple Rage Blade Galio early, it lets you snowball at tempo a lot. Ascensions of all kind are really good, silver, gold, and prismatic. And if you're able to get a support item and get a needlessly big gem to also ascend, very, very good in this composition. 3 mage is not that important to rush, but the capped version of this does play Nora, Yuumi, and Nami, and Yuumi the Galio. We did not put Yuumi here, so we need to make a note of that. And just keep in mind that bows and rods are very contested this patch, so having things like Pandora's could be really, really clutch. Also, on that note, if you have no bows, no rods, try not to pick this augment because I think you're just going to be really behind item economy and you need a lot of luck to bail yourself out. A tier is largely defined by a lot of compositions that have high peaks, but are going to be a little bit less consistent or they're a little bit more conditional in order to get there. At the very top is Varus with a Pyro Blaster setup. If you can get Varus with a +1 and get to 5 Pyro on Smolder, it actually can win a lot of games. But because of how conditional it can be, and also because it can be pretty hard to hit some of these units, we end up putting it in A, even though it has S tier power, because you're not going to be able to always hit it, and it might be pretty contested this patch. If you end up getting stuck with like Nasus 1, Varus 1, the comp actually just does nothing. And also, if you end up playing 4 Pyro, 4 Blaster instead, it's a noticeable step down. One thing also we're kind of figuring out is that I think Ezreal and Hui for 4 Blasters, you actually sub this out late game to play more 5 costs of some kind. You can justify a handful of different things, like you could play, for example, Hecarim and Xerath for Arcana. You can also try to play more Preservers and just play, Morgana plus other units. Or you can just play more shapeshifters like Briar, Nico, Swain, etc. So there's a lot of different things that you can do. I personally think Ezreal Hui is just very forgettable and you don't really need them nearly as much, but they're cheap damage sources. And if you upgrade them, they can be really good item holders. Like I often think that Ezreal ends up being a good item holder for Varus. We have Nilah as another example because Nilah ends up being a good option for you to either reroll into her or go into Varus. But it's all to say that you still need a +1. So these Pyro emblems and the requirement that we have here is very important. Varus itemization is pretty debated. A lot of times people end up slamming Shojin because Varus is like an 80 caster, so it feels like Shojin is good. Shojin's okay, but if you actually look at the data, Varus does really well with straight AD, and you can justify things like Last Whisper, IE, and Giant Slayer, or Red Buff. Those are all really good items on him. Smolder really wants Rageblade and Pyro, and then Nasus just wants tank items. If you do hit Shen 3, though, because, you know, maybe somehow high roll Shen 3, you can go ahead and put items on Shen 3 instead and give Nasus leftover items, because I've been in games where I hit Shen 3 before I hit Nasus 2. One thing to note is that if you do have Dragon with Shyvana and Smolder, you already have anti-heal in your comp, so Red Buff might not be as important. But I will say that Shyvana and Namzi is a huge downgrade to Smolder. And so if you're playing like Pyro Namzi, you are going to fall off in damage. So I oftentimes just build anti-heal until I get the dragons anyways. And honestly, if you get red buff, I just want to say, by the way, Smolder with red buff is actually quite good, even though dragons do inherently let you burn and wound. I've gotten laughed at by my chat a few times, but if you look at the data, it's actually pretty good, and I won that game that I put red buff on Smolder. It is pretty expensive of composition, though, so don't forget to take Econ, Slam in, Epoch, and anything else that just helps you build your economy early. And you also want generic combat, so Item Collector, Support Golem, Giant Mighty. These are some of the most generic type of ways to get combat strength, so thumbs up for me whenever you can get them. If you don't hit a Portal Emblem, Scholar Ryze is definitely the way you can probably play him, where you go for Scholar plus any kind of frontline. And it's very flexible. There's actually several different ways you can play this, depending on what you're hitting and not. And I really like this variation of Ryze because it ends up being that you just want to play Ryze with 4 Scholar plus anything else. Preservers are often what you go for, but I've seen people go Vertical Arcana, then just go for Ryze and Xerath duo carry. I've seen people go for Ryze with all the Vanguards instead and try to play around like Ryze, Galio, and Nora and try to tech in mages like Ryze Nami. There's a bunch of different variations. So I think this is what you should be aiming for with AP Flex. This, by the way, is one of the biggest reasons why Portal can also be a little bit riskier, because people who slam Rageblade, you might notice that Rageblade is like flexible to be played on not just Ryze, but also Smolder and Kalista. So a lot of people who slam Rageblade might just say like, I don't know what to do. I'm probably going to play AP Flex Ryze. You're playing Portal, bam, all of a sudden the Scholar Ryze player just has all the Ryzes and you can't hit a single Ryze and you're stuck on 7 Portal. That happens all the time. Don't worry, it's a very common phenomenon. And that's because these players are basically sending it at 8 to roll for Ryze. Same kind of generic BIS, which is just, you know, a bunch of rod items, or you can also go for things like Giant Slayer, Guard Breaker. One thing to know is that Shojin is noticeably poor because that's what Scholar does. So you just get a ton more mana, but you actually want to hit harder. So I recommend AP damage items on Ryze or attack speed. Nashor's is more acceptable, for example, than Shojin, in my opinion. Milio can take leftover items, or you can itemize Xerath. If you do end up charming, please charm Xerath and try to buy all the charms you can late game. I noticed that on our augments, we accidentally have 7. I'll have to add 1 more in. Reinforcement is particularly really good in this like 4-cost contested metas where Ryze is super popular. So definitely click on that and try to get to Ryze 2 ASAP. I promise you it's worth it, even though you're down combat. And it gives you 12 gold, which ends up being really good. If I were to add another generic augment here, that might be good. I think New Recruit does well in Scholar Ryze because you have so many different ways you can flex an extra trait. You can always slap in like another Arcana with like Tom Kench. You can always slap in another Preserver. There's a ton of different ways that you can splash in traits. Honestly, I love this comp. I might be a Scholar Ryze main if I get the chance to every game, because I just think that the comp is really, really fun. And the best part is you can open up Portal and you're just not getting the Portal +1 emblem. So you just end up playing into this variation instead. And it's a really common way for you to bridge into your late game if you feel like you had a good Portal setup, but it's just not working out. Poor Karma. She got nerfed so hard, and she was the most versatile 4-cost that it was splashed in all different kinds of compositions because her traits were so good, and Cancer Chrono was really, really powerful. So a lot of times Karma would just be thrown in these AP comps as the primary or secondary. Now there's pretty much just one way to play Karma, which is Preservers. And one of the most common ways to play that right now is Wukong Preservers, because Wukong is a really difficult tank to deal with now that he's gotten buffed and much more consistent at 2-star. If you can get to 3-star Wukong and you get like the double stone plate and Mogul's Mail, this is true BIS. So if you get like a Shimmer Scale, all that Shimmer start, and you get like Mogul's Mail with a stone plate, I mean, that's the recipe to go for Wukong as your front line. Otherwise, if you don't have Wukong, you can just play the same usual like Nasus plus a Nico, so you have shapeshifters, or you can even just straight up itemize Morgana as your tank. Rakan is surprisingly not really that good of a tank. I actually think Rakan is a little bit on the weaker side of actual tanking. He's more like a utility tank. He like shields and does other things, plus activate preservers, which is pretty huge. So I've been very disappointed by Rakan as a tank. Karma's best in slot is blue buff, red buff, and death cap, but kind of like what we wrote here, a lot, even though this is BIS, a lot of times you often slam whatever you can hit. So you end up going like Shojin Morello Karma, and that's totally fine. It's like weaker in the stats because this is technically better. But that's why we have things like Pandora's, because Pandora's, you want like very specific items, and you want like Stone Plate. If Wukong doesn't have Stone Plates, he knows he performs worse. If Karma doesn't have blue buff, or any kind of mana item, you know to perform worse. You probably don't actually need reinforcement in this composition anymore, because I don't think Karma is very contested anymore. This was kind of a inclusion because of how popular she was previously, but not so much. Instead, I would probably take other econ augments that might make it better for Wukong to actually get hit, because you do want to roll on 7 for him specifically. The tricky thing about Wukong with this composition is that you traditionally want to roll on 7 for a 3-cost 3-star, but the composition plays 4 costs and you ideally want to hit 5 costs. So I have seen people roll for it on 8, and you takes a little bit of hit on the odds. You go down to, I believe, 32% instead, which is still a lot, but you know, obviously you might not hit nearly as quickly. So just use your discretion. Sometimes you might be in a situation where you just want to send it on 7 and you know you're rolling for Wukong 3. I totally get it. I personally just prefer to fast 8, try to stabilize on Wukong 2 first, and then collect more Wukongs, maybe even play multiple Wukongs, and then try to find a way to eventually get to that Wukong 3. Very good if you hit everything though, but I've seen a lot of this kind of, you know, sputter out in like 5th because you just couldn't get everything online. Frost Pyro, aka A Song of Ice and Fire, is a comp that got buffed a lot. It's sort of like the lesser version of Pyro Varus. It's basically Frost Varus. And we figured out that you actually can put out Frost onto Varus or Nasus, because Nasus actually does a surprising amount of damage. And then you can go for like a 3rd damage Varus item. But no matter how you slice it, you kind of just want 7 Frost. And then just put like a bunch of sword items on Olaf. The difficulty of this composition is twofold. One is that you really need to hit Diana, otherwise you're not going to hit the 7 Frost very cleanly. And so that can be pretty tricky. The other is that you actually need so many similar items. Like Olaf wants BT, Gauge, Edge of Night, and Varus wants Giant Slayer plus other swords. So you might be really struggling on items. So don't be afraid of taking like things that just give you straight up swords. Frosty Frontlines should theoretically be really good alongside the Frost emblems, but I heard that Frosty Frontline sometimes doesn't work. Like it's supposed to, you know, revive the first time it dies, but I've seen it not happen before, and apparently it's a reported bug, so your mileage may vary. But this is pretty straightforward level 8 comp. Just play strong early game Dragon Hunters, slam things like Last Whisper and Frost. You know, maybe Shyvana can hold the Olaf items. Level, look for Olaf and Varus and Nasus, and try to stabilize and push to 9. When you get to level 9, you can play another Pyro, which is really common. Especially if you get a Pyro and a Frost emblem, it actually ends up being quite good. But the Frodan tech of my choice is to actually play Nora, because then you can use Yuumi to give the AD to Varus, or maybe even Olaf for some spice. And just watch that Yuumi Nora end up being really high value. But you could actually splash in a bunch of different things too, just any other 5 costs or maybe more shapeshifters. One thing to note though is, again, I think this is very dependent on hitting the emblem. If you just try to play this without the emblem, you're going to do pretty poorly. And I think that other comps might optimize out of this. Like, because you'd rather play Pyro versions of Varus and the way pathing works, you might not end up actually playing this very often. So I can see this moving down throughout the patch as it continues to develop, because I just don't think Frost is that reliable. But the data set's pretty solid if you get everything rolling, so, I mean, who am I to argue? 6 Sugarcraft is another composition that also requires an emblem, and that's partially what makes it A tier. The other aspect of it is that it's kind of hard to stabilize as the meta gets faster and faster by rerolling. Last patch, it got completely pushed out by things like Syndra being way too efficient and not giving you time to stack up. This meta, hero augments slowed it down a little bit, but Still pressures you if you're not online and stable at level 8. The way Sugarcraft usually goes is lean into whatever carry you're able to get to first based off your itemization. If you get a bunch of 80 items with bows and swords and gloves, go for Jinx and try to itemize Jinx 3 and maybe play around Jinx. If you end up getting a bunch of AP items, like pure AP mana casting items with a bunch of tier swords and rods, you can go for Bard. If you get a bunch of bruiser items and gloves, you can go for Gwen and try to play around Gwen with Fiora duo. So you have some versatility there. Ultimately, all that matters is you play 6 Sugarcraft. It really doesn't matter who you itemize. In fact, I saw someone play Soraka 3 Sugarcraft with mages and had Soraka hold items like Bard, and I saw her do a lot of work. So yeah, just kind of get like whoever you can online. Other really good things with Sugarcraft, item collector is really, really good. Flexible is insane with this composition because you just get free items. And more, speaking of items, Capricious Forge is always good because you want to itemize some of these units very, very quickly. If you can get to the 2,000 plus cash out and get the cake to start attacking, you will win the game. So you have that inevitability, but it is a little bit rare to get to that point. So that is the downside of Sugarcraft. The other Pyro comp that we talked about is Pyro Nilah. She's very, very good. And the cool thing is, if you get something like a Pyro Crown, you immediately get an Infinity Edge and the Pyro Emblem, which ends up being really good on Nilah immediately. And you can actually choose to play this tempo into Varus. And if you get like the Varus Pyro Blaster setup, you end up just playing a Varus comp. But if you end up in a spot where, let's say, you get extra Nilahs and you see other people rerolling 2 costs in the lobby, let's say people are playing things like Ahri reroll and pulling 2 costs out of the pool, you can actually just commit to this and play Nilah 3 with Pyro. She's very, very good. And remember, as usual, 5 Pyro is supreme. Take anything that makes sense for the line. Prismatic Ticket, Caretaker's Ally, you get the, Nilah, and you get that start going. Ends up being really, really good. Keepers is really good in any kind of like warrior melee setup, so that's always worth noting. Mentorship ends up being quite good as well because you tend to clump up. So mentorship and keepers ends up having good synergy. One thing I want to note is that you can actually go for Ashe 3 in this comp. The level 6 is often Ashe, Nilah, Akali, Shen, Hecarim, +1. A lot of times you'd play like Elise for the 3 Eldritch, and then you just like roll for that, and then slowly but surely add more Pyro. So the Briar ends up representing the Elise in this situation. But keep in mind 2 things. One, it is a tempo-oriented comp, so if you try to like lose streak because you're like, oh, I have a Pyro Emblem, I'm gonna like sell everything and just like hard roll down for Nilah, it can end up pretty badly if you miss, because it's not really a composition that comes from behind late game very well. It's usually like it pushes its lead early, and then you bleed out to a top 4. And the second thing is that Varus and Nasus are going to be pretty contested, so it could be a situation where you end up not hitting those Pyro units. In fact, I've been in games where Akali was really contested, so it might even be hard to hit Akali 3, who is quite important at times as well. One thing to note is that Akali positioning does kind of matter because she ends up dashing to the farthest enemy within 3 hexes. Sometimes you might want to put her here or like dead center, or maybe on the far edges as well. All kind of depends. If you love 3-cost reroll and you want to play something a little bit different, Veigar is back in the meta. I think it's largely due to the fact that Syndra was making things too fast and also taking a lot of the related units. So basically you would play Veigar instead of Syndra, and you play Vex instead of the Incanter, but it's pretty much the same core of Vanguards and Mages. We call it VVV for short. It's just kind of fun, the Viegar Vex Vanguards. You basically collect early game Vanguards alongside Mages, and then you have Seraphine and Blitzcrank be really cheap, efficient frontline and backline, and then in the mid game eventually transition to Veigar. Be very careful about trying to sell your 2-star board and play like Veigar 1 and Vex 1. I feel like a lot of people do that and then get really punished. Another thing about this composition is that you can actually tank Mordekaiser as your primary as well if you just hit Mordekaisers and not Vex. And personally, I feel like Mordekaiser with Vanguard might actually even be better with Vex. Plus, you don't have to do some of this cheeky like solo frontline positioning that Vex can get punished with. Another thing that makes Vex a little bit more dicey is that Ahri is really powerful and can snipe solo frontlines very effectively. So, this kind of positioning is easily manipulated against those scholar boards. So you have to be really careful about solo frontline. And for that reason, by the way, that Wukong build that we talked about previously might end up getting punished by Ahri as well. So in some ways, maybe Mordekaiser is better. You just line up your frontline 1, 2, 3, 4. Very simple, and then just have Veigar go to town. Keep in mind that Veigar scales off of charms, so buy every charm you can. We've just emphasized it twice on stage 3 and stage 4. You can get 1 charm per round, so make sure you're always trying to buy at least 1 charm. Sometimes you're gonna have to skip it though if you get like, uncraftable emblem and it's 15 gold. don't buy that. I think that's just a waste of gold unless you are really, really, really rich or you're a streamer trying to make content. Stay on 7, roll for Vex 3, pick up really strong combat augments, things that give you a lot of HP and tankiness for your front line is really good. 2 tanky in particular has performed decently well if you're able to get, the Vex 3 with like another front line. Basically just cut 2 Vanguards and you just play like, 2 tanky front line or just straight up things that help you reroll. Just like we mentioned at the very top of the video, Witchy Wallop is another hero augment variation that you can play of Ahri Scholars. The thing about it is that it's a little bit awkward since Poppy doesn't scale off of AP that well. And so if you Arcana Charm Ahri and you get a bunch of AP, late game Poppy doesn't really do much. There's a little bit of a fun trick that you can do. You can actually Arcana Charm Hecarim early game while you're stacking a bunch of AD, win streak, and be very stable. And then eventually Arcana Charm Ahri once you get all the 3 stars. And that's because charming Hecarim can actually be quite good for the durability and the AD for Poppy. And let's say you have 3 items on Poppy and you just have no items on Ahri and Zoe and all these other backline units. Don't worry about it. Just, Arcana Charm Hecarim and you can play around that temporarily while you either push levels or you continue to reroll and stall for time. That being said, it just does a lot worse in the stats because of how awkward it is. Lillia is clearly the better hero augment. And there probably could be other variations that you play with Poppy instead. Maybe you go like Vertical Witchcraft or Vertical Bastion. This is the one that's been most successful so far. Sweet Tooth Nunu is the inferior version of Blitzcrank's Zap Attack if you want to play the Kog'Maw build. Nunu may have gotten a little bit weaker because Dragon Claw got nerfed, and that actually makes the super tank hero augments a little bit worse that relies on them. Now Dragon Claw heals for 2.5 instead of 5, and they nerfed the hero augments. They nerfed one of his best items, and they nerfed the hero augment itself, and they nerfed Kog'Maw's backline. So all those things put together put him in a really tough spot. That being said, he was so good before, so he's still probably A tier. I can see it moving down based off of other builds optimizing, but I also can see it moving up because I've heard that there's other like variations where you play Bastions, for example. Like maybe you play Nunu with not just the mages in the backline, but also the scholars. Like we talked about the variation you can play with Nunu and Veigar by just combining the portal and the Taric Bastion, but there's a possibility that you just play this in the scholar line. Instead of playing Taric, you just play Nunu, and maybe that just ends up being the board. So it's a little bit unsolved. Nunu stocks are basically in flux, so keep an eye out for updates in case we optimize it further. But a couple of things stand out about Nunu in particular. One is that he is a Bastion, and we talked about how Raid Boss is exceptional in any Bastion hero augment, so there's a little bit of like an Exodia combo there. 2, I feel like Nunu actually has other builds that you can play besides Blitzcrank. Blitzcrank tends to lend itself towards the Kog'Maw and Tristana due to rolling at 5 and you pick up 2 costs. But if you roll on 6 for Nunu, you sometimes pick up other 3 costs, and if you get a bunch of AP items, you can actually play Veigar. Basically, the way that you would tie in Veigar with Sweet Tooth Nunu is you would tie in Galio and Taric. Taric is a Bastion, and that Bastion links to Nunu, play Nora, and you get the third mage there from Veigar as well. So that's how you can link to it. I think that personally it caps much higher, but it's less consistent. So a better way to think about it is Sweet Tooth Nunu with Kog'Maw is probably very clean for the top 4s. But if you play Sweet Tooth Nunu with Veigar and mages, that's a way that you can get top 2 or better and maybe even win the game, but your top 4 rate is less consistent. Pretty straightforward though. Roll at 6, try to get to Nunu 3. Really good with a lot of artifacts as well. In particular, Innervating Locket is exceptional in Nunu. That's definitely the best artifact in the stats, but some of these other ones are also really strong as well. So you can probably pop a Portal Forge, or if you get a late game artifact and you have an item remover, go for it. The B and C tier, let's go ahead and just blaze through them much quicker because these aren't going to be as common in the meta, but you might see them, especially some of the ones that are on the come up. The first is Spider Queen Elise, which is just better because Varus is better, and that whole entire package is just generally better. You know, having more Shyvana damage just makes it more consistent early game. And so you can just try to roll for Elise 3, Jace 3, which got buffed, and all these units are just generally better. One of the ways that you can actually win that I actually pulled off on ladder was to hit an early Briar, and because I was like 85 HP so far ahead of tempo because I hit Elise very quickly, I ended up biting with Briar and then itemizing her. That ended up being a really fun way to actually get the win. So lots of different powerful things you can do with Elise late game around Smolder, around Dragons, around Briar. This Kog'Maw variation is pretty much just a relic of like if you end up hitting things like too healthy or just getting a really good Kog'Maw start with no hero augment, you can just try to go for this. It does still cap pretty low though. The Kog'Maw nerfs are very, very sizable. I would say too healthy or Caretaker's Ally or just like hitting a ton of Kog'Maws is probably the condition to play it. But other than that, I would probably stay away. In fact, I can see this moving down as the patch continues to progress because I just think it caps too low and it got nerfed. Syndra is actually still playable. She's still like a B tier composition, but we have changed some of her itemization. One of the big revelations is that you want to have her with Shojin and Adaptive, I think. And then the third item could be like Death Cap or Nashor's Tooth. But for the most part, like Syndra is noticeably weaker. And lo and behold, you're playing the 4 Vanguard variation, and if other people are playing things like Vanguard, it's going to be harder and harder to hit things like Mord 3. So I don't think that you can play other variations of it as well. You're still playing the Vanguard frontline with Syndra, but I think it's going to be harder to hit things like Mordekaiser 3 as the patch goes on. So this composition won't move up very much unless there's more optimization that we're not thinking about. And I do want to say one thing, that this composition actually wants to roll on 7 and not 6, because 7's a big spike. You can get the 4 Vanguard frontline and Syndra plus Karma and potentially Nami. And that's a big deal if you're able to like get all of that online. But I know some people like to just push levels anyways and just roll for Syndra 3 at 8. You can still do that. It's just less consistent. So yeah. It's another Wukong variation that likes to play Hunter backline. It's kind of fusing the Kog'Maw Jinx with like the Preserver Karma Wukong. And this is another hybrid of it. And we figured that this is a good opportunity to show you that you can play Spin to Win Wukong. If you get Spin to Win, this is like a really solid way you can play it and roll for like Wukong Jinx and roll for 2/3 costs at 7. That feels a lot better than trying to roll for like Karma 2 at 7, which can be really inconsistent. So it's just something to keep in mind. Multi-striker Kassadin is noticeably weaker as well. Kassadin has a reduced shield, and as a result is just much squishier. I would not play him unless I have things like Keepers, for example, or Press the Attack. Really, really strong support items. Things of that sort to just make Kassadin really shine. Otherwise, he's just kind of like a sitting duck against a lot of the hero augments. Warwick is one of my favorite reroll comps this set because, you know, Corrupted Vampiric Scepter is amazing on him. So if you do end up opening up an artifact item and getting Corrupted Vampiric Scepter early, like an artifact start, and Rageblade components with Quicksilver, he pops off. But you kind of need to hit Warwick 3 a little bit fast, and you kind of need to have like the perfect item setup. Like just because you have Corrupted Vampiric Scepter doesn't mean that you can probably pull off the Warwick that easily. You still kind of need to have the Warwicks and some of these components to lean in the right direction. Otherwise, if you get Corrupt Vampiric Scepter and you don't get Rageblade until like, you know, end of stage 3, beginning of stage 4, it's probably too late. You're just gonna die. But it is very, very fun to pull off, and it's just cool to see Warwick stack super high. Arcana Fast 9 is actually quite good. I think B tier is actually underselling its real power. It's actually something that you can play if you like Fast 9 and, you know, you're playing like Ryze 1, you still haven't been able to stabilize. I've actually done stuff where I've just like Fast 9'd off of a bunch of random AP and then I just like transition to it. But it's like a super, super, super high roll comp. So yeah, you're just very rarely gonna get to that spot unless you're doing something like Golden Quest or Fortune. Just like these insane econ augments that just let you get to 9 or maybe even 10. I'm not entirely sure. So it's just kind of impractical, but it is very, very good if you can get there. And then Shapeshifter Flex is just back on the menu and quite solid because Varus is better, as well as all the shapeshifters. It's like the no hero augment version of Spider Queen Elise, where you just push tempo and you get things like Eternal Growth or a Shapeshifter +1. But it's a little bit on the rare side, and it's kind of a little bit high roll because you kind of need like exactly Nasus and Briar. Otherwise, your frontline isn't really that stable in the late game. But yeah, because of the nature of how much Varus and the shapeshifters are better, the composition is not viable. I do want to actually cover Vanguard Hui very briefly. I do think that this composition has a lot of potential. We put it at the top of C tier because it's new, but in reality, it actually can move up to top of B tier, maybe even A tier. And that's because I think 4 Vanguard is really good, but it rolls really nicely with Hui and the Preservers. If you actually look at it at its core, it's actually quite similar to Rumble Molten Caramel Hero Augment. But instead of playing Tristana as a backline blaster, you play Hui. And instead of going for Rumble 3, you go for Mord 3. So the way I think about it is Molten Caramel, Tristana is a 2-cost version of this. And Molten and Mordekaiser Hui is the 3-cost version of it. There's also a hidden version of this where you actually duo carry Ezreal and you kind of take like the Ezreal build that we show in the Portal combat build, where you go like red buff IE, and you combine it with Vanguard Hui. So you play Ezreal with red buff IE, and then another blaster like Smolder or Varus. So it's experimental. That's part of the reason why we don't know exactly where it lands. So yeah, just try it out as you will. Katarina also is going through an experimental phase. They buffed fairies, they buffed Katarina, they buffed warriors. So, you know, there has to be a Katarina build. Basically, there's two main opinions that are going on at high elo right now. The first is that Katarina is garbage. Like, she still is unplayable. It doesn't matter if you get like the ideal setup for her. She's still going to be very mid, and she just has trouble actually beating a lot of compositions like Ahri and Scholars. Second is that, you know, the composition is pretty unoptimized, and if you play her from certain spots and ahead, she's actually quite good. I think Katarina from Orb, for example, is quite good. If you get Katarina and you play like Seraphine, Lillia, Tristana, you get a 4 fairy setup with Warrior. I think I've seen Katarina do a lot in Stage 2. And also, personally, I've played Katarina twice since the patch launched, and I was so stable on Katarina 2, and I was far away from Katarina 3, so what I did was I pushed levels. I actually went fast 9 with Katarina, transitioned out of it, put those items onto like Diana and Gwen and other people like that, and then slowly but surely pivot into something else. Maybe put items on Morgana as well. And I had success like with that. So I personally think that there's a lot of room for improvement. I don't expect Fairy Katarina to be C tier by the end of this patch. I think that's probably going to move up. So yeah, keep an eye out for the tier list and see any updates on that. Eldritch is really bad. They nerfed a lot of things about it. They nerfed its main carry in Syndra. Nami is not a reliable carry at all because she can't really deal with super tanks and bruiser units. And also Mordekaiser is very contested. And they nerfed School Mascot to only give 1 item instead of 2. So yeah, it's just a lot weaker in general. We're putting in C tier, but in reality, this is almost like a never play unless you're super high rolling, or you hit like, you know, off of Wandering Trainer and you just kind of have to play it. And, you know, maybe you can get to 10 Eldritch, because 10 Eldritch is still very, very good. Best thing in the game. Just major, massive canyon between 7 and 10 Eldritch. 7 Eldritch is just very pitiful right now. You can still play other variations of Preserver. If you hit like Swain 3, Nico 3, we've seen people do that still. Not very consistent. So in general, this composition is not very good if you do end up going for it. So would not recommend. The last comp we're going to show is Dragon Reroll, which I still think has a ton of potential. They actually removed Draconic Mastery, so we have to probably change that. But I think Nami's is actually quite good. And they buff Shyvana, and they buff a lot of these units around it. Smolder is good. So, I mean, I think it has a lot of potential. Just that it's sort of very niche. So yeah, you can try Dragon Reroll if you really want, but it's not that consistent currently. But I personally think Namzi has a lot of potential. And I actually pulled it off in one of my games where I played Pyro Namzi. It was actually pretty sick. I got Namzi with Pyro, and I got Smolder with Pyro. You can check out that video on my VODs channel if you'd like to check it out on some of my latter games. So there you have it, the patch breakdown of all the comps, but very similar to last video, there's a pretty good chance some of those things are changed. So hopefully this video just helps you get started on the patch, but ultimately keep an eye out for all the upcoming meta fluctuations. Just head over to tftacademy.com and check out our tier list as well as all of our guys. There's actually 1 or 2 comps that we didn't put on here that I haven't figured out yet. Like there's variations of Fiora Gwen, for example, that we haven't put on here. But we'll definitely update the tier list as we see them continue to pop up in the meta. Most of it is just a low play rate issue because there's just not enough data on it. So it's just like theory, or we've seen it happen once or twice. And you need to just have more confirmation than just, you know, those 1 or 2 instances. All right, that's it for me this time. Thanks for watching. I'll see you guys next time.